Here we are, January 2024. If you're a Heaven Hill fan, we all know what that means. The A batch of the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof A124. We're gonna talk about that today on the My Bourbon Journey Whiskey Review channel. Hey everyone, welcome back. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. So here we are again, beginning of 2024, Elijah Craig Barrel Proof Batch A124 is now starting to hit the market, and the expectation coming off of C923 can't be any bigger. So it's going to be interesting as we kind of go through the A124 today to kind of see where or how this compares to the prior batches from 2023. So the big question is now, coming off of the C923 and their 13 years, 7 months. So what exactly is the A124 going to hit us with this year? Let's talk a little bit about some of the specs on this. This is coming in at 119 proof or 59.5% ABV. Mash bill standard, 78% corn, 10% rye, 12% malted barley. MSRP, again, give or take, I'm gonna say $75. That seems to be kind of the going price for these things for the most part, give or take, like I said, a few dollars one way or the other. And the age statement on this one has come down a few years at 10 years, 9 months. So we're dealing with a different product overall coming off of the C923. So in the end, we'll go through a little comparison just to see exactly how this profile lives up to the C923, which was my bourbon of the year in 2023. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kind of dive into today's review. We'll give you an idea of what the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof Batch A124 has to offer. Color-wise, again, beautiful, beautiful color. They're always a really nice, deep, rich kind of mahogany color, burnt orange. Moving the whiskey around in the glass, again, beautiful oils as always. We nitpick these things a little bit, probably too much. So at the end of the day, I'm gonna say they're all a buy. It just may have a different profile that works better for you. So let's go ahead and dive into the nose. Right away, I'm getting this kind of medium leather kind of tobacco note. I'm not getting hit immediately with a lot of sweetness. It feels much more traditional, or a traditional Heaven Hill kind of product. Here comes some of the fruits. I'm going to say like a medium cherry, maybe medium cherry strudel, maybe even a slight kind of like red licorice note. A little darker now, maybe some coffee cake, something along those lines. There's a nice barrel influence, more along the lines of a rickhouse oak. Right now, it's not like a heavy, like barrel char kind of note right now. Yeah, again, more cherry, maybe again, that cherry strudel kind of coming out. Maybe cherry Pop-Tart, something along those lines, with maybe a little bit of that kind of sweet like vanilla frosting on it. Now here comes some of the more traditional Heaven Hill notes with some of that peanut. Now it feels a little bit more creamy, like it feels more like a peanut butter than it does like a peanut shell kind of note at this point. It does have that kind of creamy smell to it, if that makes any sense. It's almost feeling a bit like a less sweet peanut butter and jelly. And maybe that's just my love for peanut butter and jelly, but I'm getting kind of that combo of that creamy peanut butter, some of those fruit notes. You know, again, I had mentioned some of that kind of cherry strudel or a cherry Pop-Tart. So that combo kind of has me leaning a little bit more towards that peanut butter and jelly kind of profile, but maybe less sweet. There's not that intense, like sweet fruit note for me right now. Again, I mentioned kind of like a coffee cake. I'll say even a little bit of like a chocolate or like a cocoa, something along those lines. Again, not an overly sweet chocolate so far, but I think as this thing maybe begins to open up, it may kind of change slightly. I've only had this bottle open now for a few days, and today being January 26th, we'll see exactly how this thing maybe begins to kind of open up over the next 2 weeks to a month, and really see if this thing begins to really shine. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the palate and see what this one's gonna give us. Again, the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof Batch A124. Cheers. So here we go. So I think we're getting much more of that Heaven Hill kind of profile. And what I mean by that is I'm getting hit with this kind of cherry chocolate covered peanut note. It's not a dominant peanut. And again, like I mentioned on the nose, it feels much more creamy. So this is making me feel more peanut butter than it is peanut shell. So oftentimes peanut shell can be a little bit more off-putting. And what I mean by that is much drier, much more tannic. This has a little bit more of that kind of creamy feel to it right away. Definitely some barrel char notes that it has without it being overly heavy on the char notes. So this may be more of a combo of that barrel char and that slight rickhouse effect that it has to it. So you get a little bit more of that sweetness. If you've been in a rickhouse, you know what that smells like. That smell is beautiful. So this is kind of a combo of the barrel char and that rickhouse effect. Here again, more of the fruit starting to show up, more of that cherry strudel, maybe again, even a little bit of that like red licorice kind of note to it. Nice medium leather tobacco without those notes overly dominating this. Again, like I had mentioned, this feels much more tried and true. This is a really standard offering of Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. This isn't one that you can overly nitpick, and I don't think it's one that you can really downplay or critique too much. This is really right down the middle of what it is that we all kind of look for, in my opinion, with a nice Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. Yeah, and again, it still has that little bit of a less sweet peanut butter and jelly. And the less sweet part of it is just that there's that fruit note, but just without that extra little bit of sweetness that's there. So it has that feel to it, all while having a little bit of that nice kind of medium oak presence, little bit of light medium leathers, tobaccos, and that kind of cherry chocolate covered peanut without it being overly dominant on the peanut side of things. Now, what I will say is this feels a little bit more peanut heavy. I know I've been kind of talking about peanut butter, but coming off of some of the prior batches, specifically the A123 and the C923 were ones that I felt they knocked out of the park. The B523, again, I felt was a little bit more over oaked, a little bit more tannic, a little more on that kind of drier side, heavier barrel char kind of influence on the B523. And like I mentioned, this feels like one that is just even across the board. Not one that you can really get overly excited about, and one that you're not going to, again, like I mentioned before, overly critique. It feels like it's just a nice Elijah Craig Barrel Proof offering, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. So as the finish kind of begins to develop, and again, these are always, you know, on that medium plus to long side of finishes. What I will say is, as that begins to linger, there is a little bit more of that kind of peanut note, more barrel char, maybe a slight tannic note to that on the finish. Less sweet. There is still some of that kind of cherry chocolate influence, but much more of the actual peanut is starting to kind of come out. And again, that's oftentimes a profile that you will get with Heaven Hill. I enjoy that. It's just at this level here is about as much of the peanut influence that I would want in it, because it starts to become more singular. And when you get a bourbon that becomes more singular, that for me is when it's kind of lost, meaning that the overall richness and complexity has kind of fallen off. So I don't think this is quite there. And like I had mentioned before, I think this honestly feels like at this point, January 26, 2024, feels like an average or a medium across the board Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. Again, one that I'm not going to overly critique, and one that I'm not going to overly hype at all. So again, we were talking about 10 years and 9 months, still fantastic ages for a bourbon. And again, if it wasn't for all of these different ages, we probably wouldn't critique these as much as we do. But again, coming off of like the C923, you're going to just naturally do that. So let's give you an overall breakdown. So here's how I would kind of rank this. I don't think this is on the level of the A123 or definitely the C923. I would put this ahead of the B523 only because I feel this is much more of an even keel kind of Elijah Craig barrel proof. I felt that the B523 was a little bit more over oaked. I didn't think it was quite as developed and or refined. So I would put this ahead of the B523, but again, behind probably the A and C batches of 2023. So why don't we do this real quick? We'll kind of give you an idea of my 2023 Elijah Craig barrel proof versus the A124, just to give you a little quick idea of what each one kind of has to offer. So let's go back to the C923 and we'll give you a little idea of what this one was. The C923 was an absolute monster of a bourbon. I felt this was probably one of the top, maybe 3 Elijah Craig barrel proofs that they've released. Now, again, people will maybe argue going back to the kind of pirate bottles, but in terms of the last several years, this was probably one of the top 2 or 3 of all of the batches that they had. So the A124 was going to be a really hard bourbon to kind of live up to the C923. And when we go back to the C923 and the A124, you get much more heavier, rich, refined notes than you do with the A124. Again, we're dealing with several years of aging in terms of difference. So you've got this C923, the A124 are going to be 2 completely different kind of profiles. So like I had mentioned before, in terms of the rankings, I would put this ahead of the B523, but behind the A and C batches of 2023. So there you have it. And what I'll do is I think I'm going to do a 1 month revisited to see what some airtime will do to the A124, to see if maybe something changes that I'm getting, you know, again, only after it being open 4 or 5 days. We'll see if there's some kind of change to it. So there are my kind of like first reactions to the Elijah Craig barrel proof batch A124. Let me know your thoughts on this specific batch and just the Elijah Craig barrel proof offering overall. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to follow me, you can on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of those places at My Bourbon Journey. If you'd like to help support the channel and become part of the Mash and Journey Whiskey Club, make sure you check out the Patreon link in the description below. And with that, I hope you enjoyed the Elijah Craig barrel proof batch A124. Cheers.